Well, I actually remember that Gil Scott-Heron song's old enough. And it has been fun to watch a revolution being televised, I have to say. I was telling Osama the other morning, I was watching with my grandson, who's 10, and it was it was dinner on Monday last week, and we obviously been watching Al Jazeera a lot, and he said to me, Papa, why are the people in Egypt demonstrating? And I said, they want to get rid of the president. And he said, well, why do they want to get rid of the president? And I said, because they think he's been there too long. And he said, how long has he been there? I said, 30 years. He said, that's too long. And went back to eating his dinner and never said another word. And I thought that was pretty good analysis of the situation, frankly. Now, I'm not a specialist on Egypt or Middle East, of course, although I have been to Egypt once. And I'm going to focus on two issues, the conflict between what I call state and republic, and on language. And I'm going to start not in Cairo, but in another revolutionary city, Warsaw, which has my favorite hero statue, Jan Kiliński, who's a shoemaker. That's right, statue of a shoemaker. It's the only one I know. Kiliński led the Warsaw uprising against the Russians in 1794. And after Poland became an independent country again after World War I, they immediately put up a statue right in front of what had been the Russian governor's residence in Warsaw. I wonder why. Someday, if there's any justice, Tunis will be graced by the world's only statue to a fruit seller. Now, their acts differ fundamentally. Kiliński led one part of a revolt against an occupying power. Bouazizi's heroic gesture inspired a revolution. Because I'm going to focus on language, let me stop to emphasize that word, revolution. What's happening in Egypt is not fundamentally a crisis, it's a revolution. I find it fascinating that the media are happy to talk about the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, but as Al Jazeera's rubric and everybody else puts it, crisis in Egypt. Now, why do I emphasize the difference? Mubarak's resignation might end a crisis, but it will not end a revolution. Crisis is the word of choice of the forces of order, of the Suleimans and Clintons of this world, because cosmetic change can end a brief crisis, but not a revolution. I say as an historian, my future colleagues, I think, will call this a revolution, and I think we should too. Another remarkable difference is that today's revolution is, above all, the work of a specific group. I think we should call them the Liberation Generation, in honor of those who have fallen in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Revolutions must be judged not simply on immediate results, but on long-term structural changes, which is what sets them apart from a simple crisis. Most textbooks, for example, would say that the revolutions of 1848 in Europe failed, and in the short run, that's true. Yet their main goals, male democracy, universal primary education, workers' rights, came to pass almost everywhere within a generation. That's a pattern that goes back to the Middle Ages. Wat Tyler's rebellion in 1381, they fought against serfdom. King, who was then 15, abolishes serfdom. Wat Tyler is murdered. He reestablishes serfdom. The revolt is crushed brutally, but serfdom disappears in Tyler's region within 25 years. The same thing happened in Germany in 1525 when 80,000 peasants were massacred in reprisals for revolt against serfdom. And yet 25 years later, serfdom had disappeared. So we can see also in other examples in the 19th century. The liberation generation in middle age, that is to say in 2030 or 2040, will remember what they fought for. Egypt in 2030 will be a more democratic society. What is less certain is that it will become democratic in the coming year or two. The thousands of older demonstrators long to see that happen. The U.S., acting like a state, will move heaven and earth to prevent that from happening. State and republic, we often use them interchangeably, of course, but they're profoundly different. For the last 4 centuries, since the late 16th century, rulers have sought everywhere in the Western world, and due to imperialism, often beyond, to convince the ruled that republic and state are one and the same thing. Tunisians and Egyptians have risen up to denounce this fraud for the monstrous lie that it is. The citizens collectively form the republic, whose supreme interest is the collective good of its citizens and other inhabitants, which can be achieved over the long run only by ruling according to law, reason, and justice. The supreme interest of the state is self-preservation by any means necessary. The republic appears to be chaos, but represents a deeper order, justice achieved by reason, the principle around which it is organized. Philosophically, it's everything. The state appears to be order, but is merely ordered chaos. The state has no principle beyond its own existence. Philosophically, it's nothing. Practically, the state matters a great deal. It's a different issue, because it must carry out an extraordinary balancing act. As the servant of the republic, it must provide the order necessary for the republic and its civil society to function. Seeking to serve, it must never become the master. And of course, that's what the problem is in all these states. It is the master. States always use the same technique to attack the republic: fear. We've seen plenty of that in the United States in the last 10 years. The conundrum facing citizens is how to create a state powerful enough to protect the republic, but weak enough to be unable to destroy it. The constant use of the term failed state ignores the fact that such places like Somalia or Afghanistan have failed political systems. They have no republic, no collective group of citizens committed to the rule of law, reason, and justice, at least not a large enough one. Without a republic, only a state built on brute force can survive. Even such states create, as Osama just pointed out, ostensibly moral justifications for their exercise of power. States all over the world do rely on brute force to survive. They have the greatest possible difficulty evolving into republics, as we see in Egypt today, where we have a state trying to evolve. Republic-based states, like the U.S., often conduct their international relations on the sole basis of state-to-state interaction, which gives primacy to violent means and to ends guaranteed by force. We will soon see how ephemeral ends guaranteed by force can be in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I might add there was a piece in the New York Times yesterday that, without dealing in this same terms, was talking about this conundrum in American foreign policy with respect to supporting dictators, which is one of our national sports. We cannot ignore the state-to-state dimension of international relations, of course, but an exclusive focus on that dimension creates a sort of warped value system that leads the U.S. and France to support kleptocratic dictators like Mubarak and Ben Ali. In Egypt, we hear a steady drumbeat of remarks in favor of, quote, democracy, unquote, from American officials, but a cynical policy of dumping Mubarak and keeping Mubarakism. We played Cesare, for those of you who've read Machiavelli's The Prince, we played Cesare Borgia to Mubarak's Ramiro de Lorca. What could be more embarrassing than the revelation that Ambassador Wisner, the U.S. Special Envoy to Egypt, works for the law firm Patton Boggs, which, to quote the firm's own statement, quote, advises the Egyptian military, the Egyptian Economic Development Agency, and has handled arbitrations and litigations on the Mubarak government's behalf in Europe and the U.S., unquote. Alas, for the U.S., Ambassador Wisner, in the role of Toto, the film many of you are familiar with, pulled back the curtain. And the State Department's immediate denial convinced as few people as the wizard's plaintiff, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Remarkably, the U.S. did not recall Wisner in response to the revelation of his conflict of interest, but only in light of his embarrassing revelation of the U.S.'s real policy, which was, of course, very embarrassing. Now, in understanding that policy and public discussion of it, we have to go beyond Wisner's ties. Egypt pays over $1 million a year to its lobbyists in D.C., the PLM group led by Tony Podesta, who's the brother of President Clinton's chief of staff, and by two former congressmen, one from each party, of course. You have to be bipartisan about this, one of whom was the former head of the House Appropriations Committee, so in the sort of Willie Sutton theory of government, he knows where the money is. PLM has represented Egypt since 2007. Their other clients, as you might guess, include Boeing and Lockheed Martin, who of course make the military hardware, quote, sold, unquote, to Egypt, but actually paid for, of course, by U.S. aid to Egypt. The press has pilloried Clinton for her apparent ignorance of Wisner's direct ties, or claimed ignorance. But if you turned on your television, for example, to PBS's NewsHour on the 27th of January to get analysis of the Egyptian events, you had to listen to Graham Bannerman, identified only on the television program, the Middle East Institute. Now, he said some really stupid things, and I was wondering, who is this guy? So, I mean, you know, some of the stuff he said was just awful. The NewsHour did not tell viewers that in 2007, Bannerman was himself Egypt's chief official lobbyist in Washington, D.C. Now, you'd think they might reveal that before we had to listen to him. What do you offer as an analysis? Quote, the way you make changes is that President Mubarak is strong and gives the changes, unquote. Now let me ask you, keep that in mind, that key word, gives. Speaking out Al Jazeera's Empire this weekend, Rashid Khalili rightly stated that getting rid of Mubarak is meaningless. Egyptians must overthrow the security police state. Khalili pointed to the Tunisian case where key members of that apparatus, provincial governors, police chiefs, and interior ministers have, in fact, been fired. Although I would disagree with them slightly. I think it's far from a done deal. Moreover, the internationally renowned legal scholar Yad Ben Achur, longtime advocate of human rights, heads the Governmental Reform Commission. In Egypt, as in Tunisia, we see the classic case of a state that denied the existence of civic society. And I contrast civic and civil. Civil in a sort of Hegelian sense. Civic society is this fear of politics among citizens. Many states have civil citizenship. You have protection from laws, yourself, your property, but not necessarily civic citizenship. They define the highest goal of the state, order, as the highest goal of society. Citizens in Egypt and Tunisia now demand that their society give primacy to the highest goal of the republic, that is, the collective interests of the citizens, not the privileged few. As is invariably the case in states that have muzzled public debate for years on end, Egypt and Tunisia have lacked a public sphere in which to air differences within the context of a politics built on reason and justice. So only revolution in the streets could break through and start the civic process. One danger of abolishing civic life is that opposition to the state must shift to a non-political dimension of legitimacy. And so religion often offers an ideal method, whether it's Jansenism in Louis XV's France in the 18th century, Catholicism in Jaruzelski's Poland, Lutheranism in Honecker's East Germany, Shia Islam in the Shah's Iran, or Sunni Islam in Mubarak's Egypt. Why we would focus on one of those as opposed to the other without thinking of the broader pattern is, I think, very revealing. The state will stop at nothing to save itself. No lie is too blatant, no deed too evil. Here in the UGU History Department last week, we had a job talk by Kate Brown of University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who offered a chilling modern example in her talk on the Soviet and American nuclear states and their common reactions to the problem of plutonium disposal. Ben Ali's regime prattled on about foreign terrorists or criminals being behind the demonstrations. Reminded me of when I was in demonstrations back in the 60s and 70s. We were all outside agitators. That was the phrase of the day. King Abdullah says as much about those in Egypt. Such accusations so conclusively that these doddering tyrants really do not understand the new world of communications. Accusations of foreign terrorists can be immediately discredited by those attending the demonstrations, using Twitter, posting movies on Facebook, or whatever. Everyone can see and hear for themselves that the demonstrators are the young people who live across the street, not foreign terrorists. Modern dictatorial regimes have no quicker means of discrediting themselves than the old lies which are hardwired into their DNA. As for evil deeds, what could be worse than the deliberate use of hardened criminals and the police themselves to loot and pillage and assault peaceful demonstrators? As Prime Minister David Cameron rightly said, government sponsorship of such activities is, quote, despicable, unquote. Those of us familiar with European history have seen this trick many times. You cause disruption in the streets and claim you'll bring order. Well, Hitler used that trick in the early 30s. He put thugs in the street, caused all kinds of disruption, and said, elect me, I'll bring peace. They elected him, and he did. He called off the thugs, and there was civil order. So Hitler kept a lot of his promises. Pretty scary, isn't it? Mubarak, quote, fears chaos, unquote, yet he's the one causing the chaos. That's another old trick, neatly described by Orwell in 1984. Blame your opponents of precisely what you were doing. Karl Rove was a master of this in U.S. politics. So that their accurate charges against you merely look like tit-for-tat rhetorical reprisal. Stalin was also a master of this ploy. If I may steal a phrase from Václav Havel, who knew a thing or two about peaceful revolution, I'd like to say a word about words. Linguistically, Ben Ali, Fouad Mabaza, who's the acting president of Tunisia, King Abdullah, Mubarak, Suleiman, and their henchmen like Bannerman remind this French historian of Louis XVI. Much like Louis XVI in 1789, Ben Ali seemed to sense the need to allow some public sphere to exist. But in what turned out to be his last speech, he betrayed his fundamental misunderstanding of the new reality. Quote, and I decided total freedom for the media with all its channels and no shutting down internet sites and rejecting any form of monitoring of it. And I decided. That critical phrase sounded the death knell of his Tunisia. The acting president of Tunisia, Mabaza, is no better, unconsciously revealed in his acceptance speech the same attitude. It is first and foremost, quote, in the state's supreme interest that the upcoming government be a national unity government, unquote. So Tunisia has the forces allied around Mabaza and Ghannouchi who fight for the supreme interest of the state, arrayed against those led by Ben Achour, who stands for the Republic. They hope that his commission will turn out to be that Frankfurt Assembly of our day. Frankfurt Assembly, for those of you who don't know, was this group of German intellectuals and, sad to say, university professors who gathered together in 1848 to create a unified German state with a democratic constitution. 18 months later, after fighting about where the commas should go, the King of Prussia sent a squad of police and told them to go home. And they did. Discredited academics in European politics for 100 years. Poor Mabaza, poor Ben Ali, they just can't help themselves. I have decided is the only way a Ben Ali can phrase a decision about the law. Poor Louis XVI, he too believed, quote, I want it, so it is legal, unquote. Poor Hosni Mubarak, he thinks he can give reform to the Egyptian people. Poor General Suleiman, he thinks he can just ask the parents to make their naughty children go home and behave themselves. What's far more troubling is that the Western powers, led by the U.S., seem ready to betray our own traditions by accepting the principle that a dictator can give rights to anyone. States do not give rights. Legitimate states recognize our, quote, inalienable rights, as a well-known document put it. So a warning, demonstrators cannot negotiate about creating a democratic political system with someone like Suleiman because he is simply incapable of thinking of politics in such terms. For Mubarak or Suleiman et alia, the patriarchal figure, whether he be the father of the family or the father of the nation, aka the president, gives the rules. Tunisians and Egyptians, to bridle the state, must not focus on its strength, violent force, but on its weakness, ideas. They do not want to destroy the state so necessary to the functioning of the republic, but to make it again the republic's servant, not its master. Removing a small coterie of criminals from the apex of state power will not change the fundamental relationship of state and citizens, and only a legitimate political process that places authority back where it belongs, with the people, can effect permanent change. They cannot stop with Ben Ali and Mubarak. They must rid Tunisia and Egypt of the entire apparatus of their corrupt states. That's one of the lessons of the 19th century revolutions in Europe. So long as Egypt has a security police apparatus of 350,000, so long as Egypt has a heavily armed praetorian, aka presidential guard of 20,000, no free and fair elections are possible. The process will not be easy because Egypt's institutions of civic life have been systematically destroyed by the state. What the liberation generation must learn from past revolutions is that the problem is not simply one man and his close allies, but a political system that defines the state's supreme interest as coterminous with the republic's supreme interest. Next.